Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this co-presentation by the Book Club of California and the Book Club of Washington. If you're here for the Bookseller of Florence, Vespasiano da Bisticci, you're in the right place. It is Sunday, March 13th, 2022. This is going to be a live online presentation by Ross King, the author. And we will be getting started in just a moment or so. We've got quite a number of people registered for this program, and we're going to give them time to enter from the waiting room. So just sit back, relax, and be patient, and we'll be starting in just a moment. Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. If you've just joined us and you're here for Vespasiano da Bisticci, the Bookseller of Florence presentation, you're in the right place. This is going to be a co-presentation from the Book Club of California and the Book Club of Washington. And we are going to be getting started in just a moment. So sit back, relax, and again, be patient. We will be starting momentarily. Thanks. All right, it's a few minutes past the top of the hour, and we've got an exciting program waiting for you. So we're going to get started and let people join us in progress. Good afternoon, and welcome to this co-presentation by the Book Club of California and the Book Club of Washington. This virtual program is titled Vespasiano da Bisticci, the Bookseller of Florence, and it is a live presentation by author Ross King. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and help host this webinar. Today, we have more than 175 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to the Book Club of California or to the Book Club of Washington, let me share a little information with you. The Book Club of California is a nonprofit member and donor supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The Book Club of California publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. It hosts a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like this one, on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and much, much more. The Book Club of Washington is a diverse group of book collectors, book dealers, librarians, book arts practitioners, and avid readers who share an appreciation of fine books and the desire to explore, preserve, and celebrate them. Their members enjoy a broad range of educational presentations, tours of public book-informed spaces and private collections, and other activities for connecting with fellow bibliophiles. They also publish the journal twice a year, and from time to time, books and keepsakes. For more information about the Book Club of California, you can visit bccbooks.org. And for more information about the Book Club of Washington, you can find that at bookclubofwashington.org. Now, today's presentation is the result of a partnership between these two incredible bibliophilic organizations. In fact, late last year, the Book Club of Washington reached out to the Book Club of California about working together on a program with Ross King. Only to find out that the book club was already planning to contact Ross King about doing a presentation. So I guess great minds think alike, right? Together, we worked out all the logistics, and this co-presentation became a reality. And we do hope that this talk is the first of many that we will be able to do together. And of course, both organizations really want to thank you for joining us. Now, in terms of the logistics this afternoon, today's webinar will include a presentation by Ross King and then a Q&A session. If you have questions or comments for our presenter or about the presentation itself, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the end of the hour to take questions, and we'll curate those questions and comments from the Q&A. Now, I'll be back on screen at the end of the session for the Q&A. And now, I guess it's my great privilege to introduce Gary Ackerman, who is the president and treasurer of the Book Club of Washington, and he's going to introduce our speaker and get our program started. Gary, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's been a delight to work with Kevin on this program. He takes care of all the logistics, and our organization was founded in 1982 and was patterned after the more august Book Club of California. When I read Ross King's book, The Bookseller, Florence, I thought I was encouraged by my program committee to contact him for a program, and I said, "Well, that's like a Reach University. I'm not sure that we're a big enough organization really to justify taking Ross's time." So I thought immediately of the Book Club of California being a co-host, and that really started off in my first communications with Ross about today's event. So I think it's worked well. We have, with 175 people registered, we've certainly got a very nice audience for Ross today. Kevin has kindly given me the honor of introducing our speaker. Ross was born in Saskatchewan, Canada, and received his undergraduate and master's degree at the University of Regina and a PhD from York University in Toronto in 1992, where he specialized in 18th century English literature. Ross moved to England for postdoctoral work at the University College of London and began his writing career as a novelist, writing 2 novels set in the 18th and 17th centuries. Since then, Ross has become a best-selling author of books on Italian, French, and Canadian art and history. Ross now lives in Woodstock, England, near Oxford, where I suspect he does some of his research. Many of you will know Ross King from his excellent books on art, such as The Judgment of Paris, about the Impressionists, and Defiant Spirits, about the group of 7 landscape architects who formed Canada's first national art movement after World War I. A listing of his books on the Italian Renaissance shows the impressive depth of his interest and research. These include Brunelleschi's Dome, Michelangelo and the Pope's Ceiling, Leonardo and the Last Supper, Machiavelli, philosopher of power, and Florence, the paintings and frescoes of 1250 to 1743, which is now, I told Ross, my heaviest book. In his books on art and architecture, Ross has focused on significant works or critical periods of change. He has taken a similar tack with The Bookseller, which takes place during the transition of the production of manuscripts to the printing of books during Florence's golden age. Ross has used his deep knowledge of the Italian Renaissance and remarkable talents as a writer to tell the story of 15th century Florence through the life of Vespasiano da Bisticci, the king of the booksellers, on the street of booksellers, Via Liberi in Florence. Vespasiano was producing and selling fine manuscripts to the Medicis, popes, and others seeking to rediscover the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome and build libraries. You do not need to be a collector of manuscripts, however, to enjoy this book. I could go on about the bookseller, but I know you'd rather hear Ross King talk about his book than me. Ross is speaking to us from Oxford, well, Woodstock, near Oxford, where it is now, let's see, not 8 o'clock in the evening, no, 9 o'clock in the evening. And so I want to thank you, Ross, for speaking to us across the time zones.
My pleasure, Gary. And had we done this last night, it would be after 10 my time, because we didn't change in sync with you. We don't change our time for another 2 weeks. So I get to go to bed a little bit earlier tonight than I would have had we done it with the usual 8-hour time difference. Anyway, Gary, thanks so much for the invitation. Kevin, thank you. It's great to be part of this dual book club lecture, in which I'm going to introduce Vespasiano to you, the bookseller of Florence, and I, very subtly have the cover up for you. And when I told my editor I was going to be doing a talk to these two book clubs, and I'd have over 100 bibliophiles and collectors and book lovers of every sort, he said, make sure you point out to them that it is available in paperback in April, but of course it is still available in hardback. This is the cover of it. We'll see whose hand this is in a little bit. But one thing I'll say about the cover is this is a unique cover insofar as this script, the Bookseller of Florence, and my name, and also the subtitle, were all developed specifically for the book, for the cover, by a friend of mine who's a designer named Rebecca Anaya. And so we call this the Vespasiano type, Vespasiano print, which I think is very distinctive and beautiful, and imitates some of the script, the handwriting that we're going to be seeing in the next 45 or 50 minutes or so. Like this, for example, because what I'm going to do is look, first of all, at the way in which a material object, such as a book, the parchment, the ink, the decoration, and everything like that, is a response to a kind of intellectual or cultural aspiration. It develops in response to the need of users, in other words, readers. And so I want to look at what these readers were in the 1400s and the way in which they developed and what they were looking for. And so I'm specifically going to take us to a place and time, and the place is Florence, and the time is the 1400s. I'll come back and show a few more of these images in a little bit. But first of all, let's take a drone and go over the rooftops of Florence towards Brunelleschi's dome in the distance. Here we see the twin towers, the Badia, which is the great Benedictine abbey in the center of Florence, and the Bargello, which many of you will know because that is now, this is the Bargello here, which is the great sculpture museum. Oh, sorry, I prematurely, here we'll go again. I won't stop at this time, but what I want to have us look at is I'm going to be zooming into this area right here. Just is probably the roof of this building right here, which is going to be the one in question. But I want us to look at Florence because this is the city as we see it today is very similar to what it would have been in the 1400s. Most of the things that we see in this shot were there in the 1400s, because the center of Florence is still, apart from some 19th century bits, still very much a city of the 13 and 1400s, including, of course, the magnificent cathedral with Brunelleschi's dome on top of it. And it is, of course, that kind of architecture like Brunelleschi's dome and the churches with their frescoes and everything like that that takes the tourist to Florence. Because I think if I were to stop you in the street, or I were to ask you what came to mind when I mentioned Florence, you would think of it as a place of artistry and architecture, and that sort of visual beauty, three-dimensional, tactile visual beauty. It is the place, the cradle of the Italian Renaissance, and is the city of artists, the city of Brunelleschi, who constructed the dome, of Leonardo da Vinci, of course, who was born outside of Florence in Vinci, but of course, his father worked there, and Leonardo came to town, and Michelangelo, of course, artists like Botticelli, works such as Michelangelo's David. All of this is what is celebrated most of all today in Florence for understandable reasons. There was an art historian who was a friend of Michelangelo, and he was actually the man who constructed his tomb, who celebrated Florence in a work, a series of biographies he wrote called Lives of the Artists. I'm sure many of you know it. If you don't, make sure you get a copy of it before you go to Florence, before you go to Italy to look at the art. It's a wonderful evocation of that period. But in it, he talks very evocatively about Florence and everything that it had achieved, especially in the 1400s. And he talks about how architecture revealed its excellence through people like Filippo Brunelleschi. The statues began to seem almost alive. The paintings were so beautiful and true to life that the men portrayed appeared before us just as they were seen by the painter himself. So all of this, I say, is what draws the tourist to Florence, and what I think we've all absorbed through a kind of cultural osmosis. But and I'm fully on board with all of that. I agree completely, obviously, having written a lot of books on this aspect of Florence. However, all the time that I was writing about that aspect of Florence, I was also aware of another aspect of it, which in some ways went in tandem with it, and in fact overlapped with, and in some ways preceded it, as we'll see. And you could argue made possible this artistic renaissance. And that is because of the fact that there was an intellectual renaissance in Florence as well. Florence was the city of the book in the 1400s. And for reasons I'll come to in a couple of minutes. And there's a wonderful image of it from 1493 from the an image, a hand-colored image in this case, done by someone from the Roselli family, who we'll meet a little bit later. Florence was called Athens on the Arno because of the fact that it wasn't just bringing Greek statues and things like that back to life, or having a kind of imitation of them, but because of the fact that it was rediscovering the wisdom of the ancient Greeks and Romans both. And there's a great quote from a man named Ugolino Varino, who's a poet, who wrote in 1464, which is a very crucial point in Florence because the Florentine Renaissance is really reaching its height at this point. That's the year that Cosimo de' Medici, the sort of founder of the dynasty in Florence, the banker who became the great patron of artists such as Brunelleschi, for example, and Michelozzo, people like that. And it's also the year in which Leonardo da Vinci probably came to Florence for the first time. So Leonardo arrived in a city about which Varino, who ultimately came to know Leonardo da Vinci and write poems about him, Varino wrote, "Today, there are an immense number of erudite men in the city. Some know the laws of nature, some know the stars, some know the size of the oceans." And he goes on, and even strive to comprehend the nature of God. So what we have is a kind of intellectual questing in Florence, what we would call today science, or they might have called natural philosophy, the study of the world, both directly through a kind of examination through things such as anatomy, which is developing in Florence, developing in Italy at this time, and also indirectly through the study of books and manuscripts. And so Leonardo then lands in the middle of this sort of cultural oasis, this place where all of this intellectual discovery is going on. And if we try to think about what made Florence a successful city commercially, because of course it was very affluent with wool merchants, bankers, silk merchants, it was one of the wealthiest cities in Europe, and Cosimo de' Medici was the wealthiest man in Europe. What made it successful artistically and commercially and intellectually? And if you have to point to one thing, one statistic, I would say it is the literacy rate, the 70% adult male literacy rate that the Florentines had. That today we might not regard as being very high because of the fact that even I've looked at statistics for various countries, and there is no country today that is as low as 70%. However, this was off the scale in the 1400s, 13 and 1400s. The next closest city for a high literacy rate is Paris at an estimated 25%. Some cities in Germany might have reached 20%. But once you went outside of those maybe university cities like Paris or some of the cities in Spain, you literacy falls off a cliff to the point where in villages, and especially in the countryside, literacy rate was probably about 1%. So Florence, again, is an oasis of intellectual discovery through books because they teach their children to read, as we see this young man doing. This painting now in London was done in Milan by Vincenzo Foppa, was an artist from Lombardy, but this was done for Cosimo de' Medici for a palace that was given to him. And so it's a specifically Florentine commission, which shows, I would argue, a typically Florentine scene of this young man sitting reading Cicero. And that's what boys in Florence and even some girls were doing in the 1400s. And I like to think of this as being the young Vespasiano, who we'll meet in a couple of minutes. Or being a kind of equivalent of him. Just another quick quote. Giovanni Rucellai was one of these great merchants, one of the wealthiest men in Florence, one of the wealthiest in Europe. His money all came from the fact that one of his ancestors answered a call of nature on the Balearic Islands and urinated on a plant that turned purple. And he realized he could cultivate this plant and mix it with ammonia and use it as a dye. And so the family fortune all came out of that very fortuitous answer to the call of nature. And Giovanni was the beneficiary of this several generations later with all of his wealth. But one of the things he celebrated about Florence wasn't just the merchants and the affluence that he and others had. It was what he called the outstanding scholars of Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Because Florence, more than anywhere else in Europe, had these trilingual scholars, people who knew these three languages, as well as, of course, the Italian vernacular, the lingua fiorentina, which ultimately, over the course of centuries, with promotion by Tuscans, becomes the Italian as we know it today. Anyway, Rucellai talks about how our men of letters have revived the elegance of the ancient style that has long been lost and forgotten. And we're used to this claim being made about the artists and art. Someone like Filippo Brunelleschi is recovering the architectural vocabulary of the ancient Romans. That's what was being said about him. He went to Rome, he studied ancient Roman ruins, the old monuments, measured them, and then came back to Florence and began building, doing this kind of creative imitation of those ancient models. Likewise, statuary. Michelangelo was inspired by ancient Roman statues that he saw in Rome and elsewhere. But now, as Rucellai is pointing out, this has gone on in literature as well, because these Florentines are inspired by this ancient style of Greece and Rome in particular. So last point about this is that I would just want to say that it wasn't just art and architecture that was salvaged. Florence had all of these humanists, we would call them today, who were finding manuscripts, translating Greek philosophy, Plato and Aristotle, writing in Latin prose, measuring the ocean, and so forth. And so the question I would pose then is, for what reason are they doing it? What do they hope to find in these ancient texts? Why is there this sudden interest in the ancient world in the Florence of the 1400s, in this ancient world which to their eyes had perished 1,000 years earlier in the 5th century, the third quarter of the 5th century, when the last Roman emperor was deposed in the West, and effectively maybe several centuries before that, with the loss of the grandeur that was Rome? What was it that the Florentines were trying to find in these ancient manuscripts? And the answer is that if you were alive in the early 1400s in Florence or anywhere else in Europe, you would have crawled out of the wreckage of the 14th century, the 1300s, which Barbara Tuchman, some of you might know her book, A Distant Mirror, which must be about 40 years old now, but it still is a great read with wonderful information in it. And it's about the 1300s. It's a great panorama of the 1300s. And I will say modestly that I was trying to do for the 1400s what she does in A Distant Mirror for the 1300s. But her subtitle was The Calamitous 14th Century. And it was calamitous with things like war. The 100 Years' War between England and France broke out at that time, and in fact lasted more than 100 years. And along with that, there was all sorts of factionalism and rivalry, peasant rebellions in both England and Italy, and all sorts of social disorder and violence, even worse than it had been in previous centuries. And there was also, of course, the Black Death, which I'm saying is 1348 and after, because, of course, the Black Death just didn't run 1347 to 49 over that, say, 18-month period in which as much as half the population of Europe was killed. But it would revisit Italy and Western Europe every 10 to 12 years and take away perhaps 10% of the population. And so Italy, Europe was depopulated, drastically depopulated between the 1340s and say the 1440s. Florence had a population in the time of Giotto. Giotto died in 1337, the great Florentine painter. When he died, on the day he died in Florence, the city probably had a population of as much as 120,000, which in the 1300s is a large metropolis. However, the city of Filippo Brunelleschi, a century later in, say, the 1420s and 30s, is as small as 37,000. So it's lost a huge part of its population, largely due to things such as the Black Death. And so there were other problems that they had as well. The church did not seem to have answers to the kind of social disorders that were going on in the 13 and early 1400s. You probably heard about the schism in the church. First of all, the church had abandoned Rome. The Pope left Rome and went to Avignon in 1309 to take protection from the French king. When it finally came back in the 1370s, one of the popes died soon afterwards, and another then popped up in Avignon. And so you had for decades two popes, one in Rome and one in Avignon, each claiming to be the vicar of Christ. In 1409, they held a conference in Pisa to try to solve the problem, and they just made it worse because the guy they elected in Pisa claimed that he was the Pope, and the ones in Rome and Avignon refused to resign. And so you had from between 1409 and 1417, when the situation was kind of resolved, you had three people claiming to be Pope. So the church was weakened. It had been away from Rome. Rome was in a terrible state of decay at this point. It was really run by feudal barons, families like the Orsini and the Colonna, who were really mafiosi. And so everything seemed to be falling apart. And so what people began asking, Florentines in particular, as we'll see, were a series of questions, searching questions about themselves and their society, about how they could have better princes and leaders, how they could educate them as well as their children, how they could come up with laws which could preserve a kind of order in the city and the countryside, and how they could have things like good rhetoric for speeches, how their Latin could become more polished so that A, the laws could become better, they could become better speakers, people could simply become more educated. And also they were concerned about things such as history and patriotism, how they could serve their city, and also just everyday things like how can I be a good friend, how can I find happiness, the kind of everyday things. The Bible, no one disregarded the importance of the Bible, but the Bible did not answer these questions. It was not a playbook for life in the here and now. The Bible is the playbook for life in the hereafter. And what they found is that it was not giving them the answers that they wanted for a kind of civil and civilized society. And so they had to look elsewhere. In Florence, these questions were asked with a particular urgency because Florence was not just unique because of its 70% literacy rate, it was also unique because it was a republic. It wasn't the only republic in Italy. Siena was a republic. Pisa had been a republic until Florence overtook it and crushed it in 1406. But Florence, nevertheless, if you looked around Europe, you saw the Kingdom of Naples, you saw the King of England, the King of France, and so forth, all of the princes in Germany, all of these people who were tyrants, the Duke of Milan, for example, all of these people who ruled. You had a single ruler with his knights, with his nobles, and so forth, and this very hierarchical, stratified, really medieval society. Florence, though, went back to very self-consciously the Roman Republic and saw itself as a continuation of the grandeur that had been the Roman Republic. And they therefore asked many of the same questions of themselves that Cicero and other people who lived during the time of the Republic had asked about their fellow citizens. And so they had a concern for citizenship and patriotism, liberty, equality. What are the political virtues? What are the duties of a citizen? In Florence, a city of, let's say, 40,000 people at this time, about 5,000 had the right to hold office and vote. For us, that's not a very great franchise, not a very wide franchise. All of these, of course, were property owning men who were not in arrears in their taxes, who were over the age of 29. Nevertheless, it is 5,000 people who can hold office in this building. And so they have these questions about how we as businessmen are not just going to make Florence great economically, but make it great politically. And so they then realize that they think the answer is going to be found in the past, in these works from ancient times. And the prophet of this was someone who was not a Florentine, but he came from a Florentine family, which was exiled in 1302, at the same time that Dante was. Petrarch's father was exiled, and so Petrarch really grew up in various places in Italy and then ultimately in France. But Petrarch looked at what Barbara Tuchman calls the turbulent or the calamitous 14th century. He called his period the Dark Ages. He said he was living in the worst age of humanity, which was maybe a little bit of an exaggeration if you look at a lot of times prior and post 1300s. Nevertheless, he felt that the civilization had reached its deepest point. However, he was optimistic that the world, and Italy especially, could come back. He said, if the Italians begin to know themselves again, we can launch a kind of comeback and be great once again. And so at the end of an epic poem he wrote called Africa, which is about the great Roman general Scipio Africanus, he writes about how this sleep of forgetfulness will not last forever. When the darkness has been dispersed, our grandsons will walk again in the pure radiance of the past. And so this radiance of the past knowledge, the wisdom of the ages of the ancient Greeks and Romans, is what they begin searching for. And so they begin looking through monastery libraries, ransacking them to try to find the ancient manuscripts that no one has seen for the previous 300 or 400 years. This is the Chain Library in Hereford, where I was last week and took advantage of it to shoot this little film. And so they began looking for works like Cicero, the great writer of the Roman Republic, or Quintilian, the great rhetorician, the great teacher, educator from the time of the Emperor Domitian. They looked for the great geographer Ptolemy, and of course Plato, the great Greek philosopher. They wanted to find all of these manuscripts and bring them back to Florence and then disseminate them. And so that's the point at which this is when Vespasiano da Bisticci steps onto the stage of history, because he's the one who's going to be essential to this project of dissemination. He was born, as you can see, in 1422, and he died in 1498. Those dates are significant because of the fact that he really encompasses what he himself called the golden age of Florence. He talked about the time, especially his early years under Cosimo de' Medici, who, as I said, died in 1464. He said that this was this golden age when Florence had men of wisdom and taste and appreciation and things such as that. Now, I'm not expecting many of you will have heard of Vespasiano because he's not well known to history for a number of unfortunate reasons. If you do read about him, it might be in a biography of Cosimo de' Medici or Lorenzo de' Medici, Lorenzo the Magnificent, Cosimo's son, who both used him as their bookseller. He supplied them with books. And that's how you see him described, with the epithet Cosimo de' Medici's favorite librarian and favorite bookseller. And I often saw that as I read about 15th century Florence, and that always threw up question marks. What did it mean to be a bookseller in Florence at that time? What sort of books did Cosimo de' Medici buy? And who else was buying books from Cosimo de' Medici? And that really launched me then on my project to write this book about Vespasiano. And very quickly I found out he wasn't just Cosimo's favorite bookseller. He was everyone's favorite bookseller. He was the greatest merchant of knowledge of the 1400s, probably the greatest dealer in handwritten manuscripts of all time. He was known as the king of the world's booksellers. As we'll see, he dispersed manuscripts all across Europe to the crowned and laureled heads of Europe. So decided I was going to write about him. We don't know, just to introduce him a little bit, we don't know his exact birth date. It's you can sort of tell from his tax records. He was born in the second half of 1422, based on the age he gives on his tax returns later in life. And he was born into what was a sort of affluent family. His father, Filippo or Pippo da Bisticci, was a wool merchant who seemed to be making quite a good fist of it. He was relatively successful, but tragically died in 1426 when he was in debt. He had taken on a load of debt to expand his business. He died in 1426 when Vespasiano was 4, and when Vespasiano's mother was pregnant with when she had 5 children, and she was pregnant with the 6th. And so he grew up in hardship thereafter, and his lodgings in the first 10 years or so of his life can be traced through his mother moving to increasingly modest lodgings around Florence, pursued by the bailiffs and people to whom Pippo da Bisticci had owed debts. So he had quite a humble upbringing. But one of the remarkable things about him is that he, in some ways, is a very Florentine story. Had Vespasiano grown up in another city in that kind of poverty, we might never have heard of him. But somehow, again and again, the Florentines in the 1400s, even going back into the 1300s, seemed to be great talent spotters, and you were allowed to reach your potential in the city, in your chosen field. And that appears to have been what happened with Vespasiano, because at the age of 11, this fatherless boy from the poor family, whose mother has all these mouths to feed, has to leave school. So he would have begun school at probably 5 or 6. So he just would have had 5 or 6 years of schooling, and then he goes to work to earn a crust of bread, which was not that unusual. Poorer children in Florence, children from poorer families, often went to work at 11 or 12 for the wool merchants and people like that. So one of the things, if we want to idealize Florence, we must keep in mind that they did have what we today would call child labor. He went to a very particular place. He went to as Gary was saying, he went to the Via dei Librai, the street of booksellers. Many of you will have walked down this street if you've been to Florence. I'll just situate us. Here is the town hall, what we today call the Palazzo Vecchio, the old palace with the piazza in front of it. Brunelleschi's dome is here. And this is today the Via del Proconsolo, which is one of the main north-south arteries in Florence. We're sort of hovering over the Uffizi here with the Arno just behind us. We're looking north. And this stretch of it, a couple of blocks, was known as the Street of Booksellers because of the fact that there were, in the 1420s and 30s, there were 8 booksellers there. And by the 1460s and 70s, there were a dozen. So this is where you went to buy books, paper, parchment, pens, things such as that. And the place where Vespasiano went to work still exists today. Here's, I'll just situate us. Here's the Bargello, the sculpture museum, with the Michelangelo room on the ground floor, and the Donatello room above that. And these are the steps here of the Benedictine Abbey, the Badia that I showed you in that aerial shot we had of Florence. And Vespasiano went to work for a guy named Michele Guarducci, who was a cartolaio e legatore, in other words, a bookseller or stationer and bookbinder. And it's unclear, Vespasiano never said in his writings why he started work there, how he came to work there at the age of 11. And so all sorts of possibilities exist. Either his schoolmaster noted that this very intelligent boy with a great aptitude for learning, which he certainly had, should go to work in a bookshop. Or perhaps Michele Guarducci saw this kid always hanging around outside a shop, wanting to learn, and therefore took him in. Or perhaps it was just fortuitous that this happened. In any case, it's one of these wonderful things where the right person arrives in the right place at the right time. And it's the right place because outside the Bargello, it was the palace of the chief magistrate in those days. It wasn't a museum, obviously, but this area here was known as Sul Canto del Palazzo, the corner by the Palazzo. And it's where the intellectual luminaries in Florence and any visiting intellectual luminaries would come and discuss philosophy. So this is one of a place for al fresco debate and discussion. Probably one of the most famous places in Florence for that. And it just happened to be outside Guarducci's bookshop. And of course, what's going to happen is that these intellectuals, when Vespasiano takes over this shop, they're going to move inside the bookshop, and it's going to become the place of intellectual discussion. If you go to Florence, you can still go into Vespasiano's bookshop, but alas, you can't buy a book there, but you can buy a pizza there. It's now a pizzeria. For a long time, I thought this was the door to it. This building has a beautiful door. It's a women's clothing store, and it has a beautiful door with a sort of gray limestone called Pietra Serena on either side. It has beautiful carvings with an open book. And for a long time, people thought that was Vespasiano's shop. But a friend of mine is an expert on the Badia, and she pointed out to me irrefutable proof that Vespasiano was actually in the pizzeria, not in the charming one next door. In any case, what is a bookshop like in Vespasiano's time? What is his bookshop like? They catered, I guess a bookseller in those days was a kind of combination of today's new and used booksellers, but also printers, publishers, and things like a reading room or debating society. Because Vespasiano, besides selling books, selling manuscripts, the pre-printed books, of course, at this point, besides selling manuscripts, new and used, and binding them, because there was a room at the back where they put them together. So this was a kind of book manufacturing place. It was an artisanal workshop, as well as a place of intellectual debate, because Vespasiano's bookshop became a kind of lending library or reading room where people, as I say, came off the street into the shop. And there were all sorts of accounts of famous debates taking place there. Some of you might know of San Bernardino of Siena, the great fire and brimstone Franciscan preacher. He came to Florence and had a debate in Vespasiano's bookshop against a very good friend of Vespasiano named Antonio Manetti, who was the greatest Hebrew scholar of the century, and the man who made the first translation of the Old Testament into Latin from Hebrew since Saint Jerome 1,000 years earlier. And so it becomes this place of great intellectual inquiry, and there are all sorts of eyewitness accounts of scholars gathering in the bookshop, and they're surrounded by people listening to them. So this becomes a very important place, and it's all thanks to Vespasiano. The second thing that the bookshop was, besides a debating society, was a place where gossip and information was exchanged. Vespasiano seems to have been quite a gossip. He knew everyone. Usually, if you came to Florence, if you were any kind of dignitary, a visiting cardinal, for example, you would first of all go to Vespasiano's shop. In the first place, because you might want to buy some of his manuscripts, but more to the point because he could affect any introduction you wanted to make. So if you wanted to meet Cosimo de' Medici, he was the one who would do it for you because he knew Cosimo very well. The two of them were very good friends. And Vespasiano ultimately did become, as I describe in the book, a spy because he knew all of the factions in Florence, and he knew very powerful people outside of Florence, some of whom we'll see in a couple of minutes, who were his clients. And so he could pass information back and forth between them. And as we'll see, at times he almost acted as a kind of ambassador as well as a spy. I'll come to some of that in a few minutes. But first of all, I want to look at the way some of his books and the way that he constructed them. He did use paper, but for the most part, he used parchment. And because he was dealing with a high-end clientele who wanted their works on parchment, which they believed at that time would last longer than paper, even though by this time, paper had been around in Italy for almost 200 years, and the books that they had done with rag paper were still very durable and had survived incredibly well. Nevertheless, for decoration and things like that, parchment seemed to be preferable to it. And so one of the first things he did probably as an 11-year-old working for Michele Guarducci was to go to the parchmenters who lived down the street or had their offices down the street from the workshop and get bundles of that, bring it back, and he probably would have ruled it, measured it up, and dragged his stylus across, ruling it for the scribe. And he would then, of course, take it to the scribe who would begin writing on it. I'll just read a brief passage from the book on Vespasiano's work on parchment. This is just a minute or two. The word manuscript comes from the Latin manuscriptus, written by hand, but a manuscript was the product of much more work than simply the writing of a single hand. It was a months or even years-long multi-step process calling for the expertise of a series of tradesmen and specialist craftsmen, from parchment makers to scribes, miniaturists, gold beaters, and even apothecaries, carpenters, and blacksmiths. Vespasiano occasionally produced works on paper, of which, like all cartolai, he carried ready supplies. For the most part, though, his clients expected him to use parchment. Cartolai carried stocks of parchment, which was made from the skin of sheep or goats, and sometimes also from donkeys. The most beautiful and expensive material on which to write was calf skin or vellum, the word vellum coming, like the word veal, from vitulus, Latin for calf. The younger the calf, the finer and whiter the skin. Uterine vellum from aborted or stillborn calves was the finest and whitest of all, but also infrequently used for obvious reasons. The supply of hides for parchment was always dependent on the dietary preferences of the local population. The appetite in Italy for goats, one recipe book offered advice on how to spit, roast, boil, or stew them, how to cook their eyes, ears, lungs, and testicles, and how to make pies from their heads, meant that manuscripts in Italy were often made from goat skin. This reliance of the book industry on the palate of the locals is reflected in the lament by a 13th century bishop that not until after Lent, when people began eating meat again, would he be able to get the hides required for a manuscript. For hundreds of years, the transmission of knowledge had depended on carnivorous appetites and good animal husbandry. Large volumes with hundreds of pages required the skins of many animals. One goat was often needed for each page of parchment in a large liturgical book, such as an antiphonary, while a Bible might take the skins of more than 200 animals, an entire herd of goats or flock of sheep. So if these days all knowledge is dependent on the electricity and a good Wi-Fi connection, in those days it was dependent on the hides of animals, and to a lesser but increasing extent on paper, on the availability of rags and such things to make paper. Anyway, let's look at one of Vespasiano's manuscripts. This is one he created for an English client. He had clients all across Europe. This was one done for someone named William Gray, who would ultimately become the Bishop of Ely. He was one of the great English scholars of the period. He spent many years in Italy, initially as a kind of a diplomat, the king's representative to the papal court. And so he created this a beautiful manuscript. I'll come to the decoration in a minute, but I want to look at the handwriting, because this is a particular style of handwriting used by all of Vespasiano's scribes. Vespasiano did not develop it. It developed some 20 years before he was born in Florence in the first years of the 1400s, thanks to a man named Poggio Bracciolini, who really is the one who designed it. And I'll come to why he designed it or how he designed it in a couple of minutes. But what they felt about this, what the Florentines felt about it, is that it looked ancient. It looked like the way the ancient Romans would have written. And we can be thankful to them because, I mean, it's very easy for us to read today, or at least you don't have to know Latin to make out what these letters are. I mean, you just have to learn that what looks like an F is actually an S and things such as that. And we can make it out very, very easily. And it's very beautifully spaced. It's very rounded. And it's very different from the script that preceded it, which of course we today call Gothic, but which in the 1100s, it was developed in the late 1100s in France, northern France, the same time and place, maybe not coincidentally, that what we today call Gothic architecture was developed. They called Gothic architecture opus modernum, modern work. It was modern because it wasn't ancient. It wasn't like what the ancient Romans had done. And likewise, they called this modern letters because this was a new style of handwriting. But it was a difficult type of handwriting, difficult to write in this style and difficult to read it. Petrarch, the man I mentioned earlier, said that it's very beautiful, but it looks as if it was done for something other than reading. Because, I mean, look at these words here, ad dominum Deum nostrum, to the Lord our God. We've got AD, and then we've got the DO fused together. Maybe not too much of a problem, we can adjust to that. But then look at minum. There are 11 consecutive strokes, identical strokes, consecutively, 11 of them. And so it's very, you really have to decipher this. You have to read it very slowly. Deum with the D and the E fused, and then 5 strokes giving the the U and the M, and then nostrum, the last word. And just look at something like the O, which takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 strokes of the pen. So this is something that's very slow to write. You write with a thick nib pen. You remove the pen from the page frequently in the course of writing, as I say, 6 times in the course of making that letter O. And it's very difficult to read as well, a very slow progress. So this is not a style that's going to lend itself to scholars who want to assimilate large amounts of information quickly and do a lot of reading. Incidentally, if you wonder why we indent in our books, this is the reason why, because there was going to be something else before this. There was going to be an illuminated capital, but you could get a manuscript and then hand it over to the client, who maybe then did not want to pay the extra sum to have it decorated by an illuminator. And so there are all sorts of blank pages, blank spaces where the capital should have gone. And when printers come along and begin printing manuscripts and they see this, what is a kind of an appealing break in the text, they decide that they'll preserve it. So just as a footnote, that is the origin of a paragraph indentation. But the Florentines, who did not like that style of writing, which they didn't like anything that came from north of the Alps, the things that were German, the German architecture, French architecture, etc. And instead they began finding what they thought was a much older style of writing. And in fact, it was older. It wasn't as old as they thought it was. But when they began recovering ancient manuscripts of Cicero and Quintilian and so forth, they found them written in this particular hand, which they found much easier to read. It seems that, although we don't have any firm indication that they actually believed this, but I think the assumption that they did might be safe, they seem to have believed that this was the handwriting of the ancient Romans. It seemed to match the way what Cicero said about his friend Atticus when he talked about the beauty of Atticus's handwriting. And in fact, this is much more recent. This is from around the year 800 when Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, ultimately the Holy Roman Emperor, wanted to have a standardized form of Latin and standardized handwriting so that he could administer his empire. And so scribes in the north of France, initially a place called Corbie, developed this style of handwriting, which may well have been based on a Roman bookhand. I should stress that we today aren't all that sure what the Roman bookhand was like, because the Romans, of course, did not work on parchment. They worked on papyrus and also wax tablets and things like that, which are very perishable. And so we have a very limited amount of their handwriting, and the Florentines had even less. They effectively had none. They seem to have thought that this then was the style of handwriting used by the ancient Romans, and that therefore, in the way that they were imitating in their architecture, the rounded arches and circular columns of ancient Roman architecture, they would imitate the sort of round cursive style of this pseudo-Roman style of writing, which was actually developed much later and in a different country. And so that's what this was based on. And the Florentines developed a name for it. One of Cosimo de' Medici's catalogs for his books stresses that these are the interesting thing about the catalog is it gives the kind of handwriting that each book is in. And what he's clearly doing is having his books turned from the old style of handwriting, Gothic, into this new style, or what he specifically calls new antique letters. And that's a good description of the Florentine Renaissance. In some ways, the antique is being made new again, whether it's in architecture or handwriting or the discovery of books. Just a quick comment about what the people often ask me what the ink was like, and this is the recipe for it if you want to try to make it at home. I'm not sure what would happen if you use the root from a mountain ash and the bark from a walnut tree, if it would not work at all. This seems very precise. And of course, these are just the ingredients. There's all sorts of distillation and mashing up and things like that that go on in the creation of it. Vespasiano probably didn't do much of that himself. There were specialists who would have done this. It was probably done across the street in the Badia, because monasteries and abbeys were places where you would have this sort of kind of artisanal work going on. So this is the illuminated capital that we saw, very beautifully done. Once the scribe finished with the work, most of Vespasiano's scribes, incidentally, were notaries, because notaries had good Latin and they had good handwriting, and most of them were trained in this new style of handwriting, what today we call the humanist script. Once the scribe was finished with it, he would give it to Vespasiano, who would then go and get the illuminator to work on it. And the illuminator would go to work with the illustration. And he would, first of all, the first thing he would do would be to put on the gold leaf, which was put on. People often think gold leaf is the most expensive thing, but of course, in many ways, it's inexpensive, because you could take a gold coin the size of a quarter, and bash it with a 15-pound hammer between the intestines of an ox, which is what the batalori or gold beaters used, and pound it to the size of your living room floor, or at least your kitchen floor. And so it didn't take a lot. It would just take the small coin, the florin, and you could illuminate a lot of manuscripts. Nevertheless, it was very labor intensive, and it had to be laid on very carefully, and then it would be polished to a high shine. It was polished with either a pebble from a riverbed, or more often a dog's tooth, a canine incisor, which would be glued onto a stick. And this would be polished until it had this beautiful shine that made the book illuminated. It illuminated the book. More expensive, though, was the blue, which is ultramarine blue. And it literally came from beyond the sea, because it came from the Hindu Kush mountains in northeastern Afghanistan, which was then the only known source of lapis lazuli, which was the stone that was crushed to make this most beautiful of all the blues. And so it was incredibly expensive, much more expensive than the gold leaf. Likewise, extremely expensive is the little yellow dots that you might be able to see there, because that's saffron. And saffron comes from crocuses, and it takes 4,000 crocuses to make a single ounce of saffron. The best crocuses came from either Persia or the Balearic Islands. So in any case, they had to be imported from abroad. And so obviously, Vespasiano's books cost a lot of money. They were labor intensive, and they had materials that were very expensive. And just to give you an indication of what the most expensive of them cost, if you wanted, for example, a single volume of his The City of God, it would by St. Augustine, a huge book, or maybe Pliny's Natural History, a volume of that, it could cost you. And so something that was possibly 300, 400 pages parchment in length, decorated, and of course, written out by one of the fine scribes, that would cost you 75 florins or ducats. They're roughly equivalent at this time, a gold coin. And to put that sum in context, 75 florins was probably the wage of the guy who taught Vespasiano his schooling when he was 8, 9, 10. The schoolmaster might be able to earn, in a very good year, 100 florins or ducats. An artisan, maybe a master stonemason, might get 100 or 120 ducats or florins per year. So a book is an extremely expensive item. And Vespasiano, obviously, then he did sell cheaper ones. You could buy things for 4 or 5 florins, but likewise, that was still fairly expensive if you just had earned 50, 60, 70, 80 florins per year. But Vespasiano, of course, had people who did not care what the manuscripts cost, because what they were doing, where they were princes around Italy, around Europe, who were burnishing their unsavory reputations for savagery and violence with cultural patronage by building beautiful libraries, commissioning paintings, making beautiful palaces, and so forth. These are just a few of Vespasiano's clients. He had great scholars, as well as men who weren't scholars so much as often, like Borso d'Este, for example, people who were quite brutal warlords who simply wanted to have a good library because everyone else had one, and he had sacks of money and decided that he, in order to create a hostage for posterity, would create a beautiful library. Vespasiano worked for all of them. He worked for Cosimo de' Medici, his sons Piero and Giovanni, who were even more enthusiastic book collectors than he was, and also then Piero's son Lorenzo the Magnificent, he worked for. Tommaso Porentucelli was said to be one of the greatest scholars in Europe, could recite the Bible from beginning to end, and was one of Vespasiano's best friends. He became Pope Nicholas V in 1447. The epithet attached to him is the first Renaissance Pope. He worked for 3 generations of the kings of Naples, all brutal characters, incredibly unsavory, and yet also great patrons of the arts, and all sorts of other people as well, including Cardinal Bessarion, who's the man we see here, who was not an unscrupulous character like so many of the others, was a great scholar and a great theologian, a great scholar of Plato as well, probably the foremost authority on Plato in the first half of the 1400s. He was a Greek who came to Italy and stayed there and converted to Roman Catholicism. And probably the greatest of Vespasiano's clients was, again, one of the most unsavory, but someone who was genuinely a good scholar, or at least very interested in books, and that was the Duke of Urbino, Federico da Montefeltro, for whom Vespasiano put together what he called, with perhaps no false modesty, the finest library since antiquity. Federico was the greatest soldier of the age, the highest paid warlord in Italy. If you were going to war with the Pope or against the Duke of Naples or anyone, and you wanted to win, you had to get Federico da Montefeltro on your side. You had to pay him and then hope that your antagonist wouldn't pay him extra. to turn against you. He was a fairly unscrupulous character, but he loved books, and we see him sitting here reading one of the books that Vespasiano created for his magnificent library in his palazzo in Urbino. So you notice he's wearing his armor and reading a book with his one good eye, because he had his right eye gouged out in a tournament when he arrogantly disdained a visor in a joust, and therefore put his career as a warlord in danger, so much so that he had the bridge of his nose removed so he would have better peripheral vision to his right from his left eye. Anyway, interesting character, and Vespasiano's greatest client, and the man for whom Vespasiano created, just to sum up, what was his greatest book, the Urbino Bible, his masterpiece of all the thousands that he created, a 2-volume set done over the course of 2 years in the late 1470s. And if we think of manuscript illustration as a minor art, we just have to look at some of the names of the people involved in the production of it. He has, for example, the Ghirlandaio workshop. Probably the greatest illustrator is this Francesco del Chierico, but the Ghirlandaio workshop was the most prestigious group of painters in Florence in the 1470s and 80s. And in a few years after this, Domenico, the leader, would go to Florence to begin working on the walls of the Sistine Chapel for the Pope. And a few years after that, a young kid named Michelangelo Buonarroti would be brought to his workshop and begin training there. So these are high-profile people who are working on expensive and very high-profile commissions. However, there was a problem with the Urbino Bible. It was finished, as you saw, in 1478. And in 1478, war broke out between Federigo da Montefeltro, for whom the Bible was destined, and Lorenzo de' Medici, whom Federigo, in concert with the Pope, Pope Sixtus IV, tried to kill in what's known as the Pazzi conspiracy. This is a kind of melodramatic representation of the scene done in 1900 by a painter, but I think it captures the drama of this assassination attempt in the cathedral in Florence in April of 1478, when the assassins struck during Mass, killing Lorenzo's younger brother Giuliano and injuring Lorenzo himself, who, however, managed to survive. In any case, Lorenzo became aware that Federigo da Montefeltro was behind this hit. And Federigo then, knowing that Lorenzo knew, began fretting that the Bible, on which the ink was still wet, was not going to come to him in Urbino. And so with the pride, this thing that Vespasiano had been working on for 2 years, he was worried he was not going to get because of this assassination attempt. And so Federigo appealed to Vespasiano, his friend, to appeal to Lorenzo to let the Bible go. And Vespasiano also knew Lorenzo very well. And so he managed to solve the problem. And Federigo later wrote, or in fact, just a week or two after the assassination attempt, he wrote to Lorenzo thanking him for sending the Bible, saying about how Vespasiano promptly and with goodwill offered every help. So this was the sort of power he had. Vespasiano could sort of stop the battle in mid-clash and have the Bible taken to Urbino for Federigo. When my editor read that passage, he wrote in the margin that this is like the Christmas truce in the trenches in December 1914, when the Allies and the Axis powers stopped shooting at each other, got out, played football, played soccer in no man's land, and then at midnight went back and started shooting at one another. Just to bring Vespasiano's story to an end, then, he did not embrace the printing press. He said a printed volume would have been a shame to be among the books that he created for the library of Federigo da Montefeltro. And he said that for two reasons. One, he thought they couldn't be as beautiful. But secondly, which I think is debatable because a lot of early books are incredibly beautiful, but he also believed, and he might have had a point here, that they would not have had the attention to detail that he had, because Vespasiano always made sure he found the best exemplar, a good copy of the work to make his copy from, whereas printers are much less concerned with things such as that. And so he never embraced the printing press. And the result, of course, is that he was unable to keep pace with the changes in the book trade that were unleashed albeit quite slowly, across Italy. Ultimately, after Gutenberg invented the printing press or perfected it in the mid-1450s, when the Gutenberg Bible came out. The Bible comes to Italy, the printing press comes to Italy a decade later in the mid-1460s. Two German printers, people who'd worked with Gutenberg, came across the Alps, descended into Italy with the secrets of the printing press, set up in Subiaco and then ultimately in Rome, and began printing books. Gradually, over the course of 20 years, the printing press spread through Italy. The Italians were the people of the printed book. And Vespasiano in 1480 called his lawyer, his solicitor, his notary, a man named Ser Piero da Vinci, who was Leonardo da Vinci's father, who had his office about 2 doors away from Vespasiano's bookshop, and said, "I'm retiring, I'm giving up my bookshop." And he retired to what he said was his sweet and lovely place at Antella, about a 2-hour walk outside of Florence, his family patrimony, where he lived out the rest of his days, maybe dreaming of the golden age of Florence, but crucially writing about it, because what he did from 1480 until 1498, when he died, was he wrote his, what's now known as Lives of Illustrious Men of the 15th century, which are all of the people that he knew, all of his clients, and he tells us private stories about them, about Cosimo de' Medici, Pope Nicholas V, and so forth. So it's an incredibly valuable resource in which, fortunately, he does manage to tell us somewhat modestly things about himself. So I'll end on that note and hope you have some questions for me. And I just remind you the book is coming available in paperback. And I also would be remiss not to point out that if you're interested in many of these things, I've got a YouTube video channel in which I have short films on the printing press, the Hermetic text, the development of libraries, the translation of the Bible in the course of the 1400s, etc. So you might want to check that out. So I'll come out of this, but if you have a question specific to any of the images that I've had, I can easily come back into it and take the questions from you.
Ross, that was amazing and so detailed. There are a bunch of questions in the chat and the Q&A, some of which you answered along the way, but we may go back to some of those and wrap them up and make sure people caught the answer if you said it. But I have to just say that this is kind of an exhilarating way to spend a Sunday, listening to you and the history and the culture and the politics of Florence in the 1400s. That was cool. And then introducing Vespasiano and his work, and then of course the bookshop of the time and like what was included there, because I'm not sure many people knew that. But I really want to say thank you for making all of this super accessible, all this content and information, because there's a lot of it. And I think Gary said early on, you don't need to be a collector of manuscripts to really get this book and get this information and love it. And I think that was so true. You made this super accessible to everyone.
Thank you.
So thank you for doing that. Gary, do you want to say something before I ask some of these questions?
I would just second that. There's so much of the politics of Florence that's also covered in this book, because he had to kind of balance himself, as you point out, in the war, but even just within Florence, he had to stay in good terms with the changing times. And there's there are a couple of questions I think that may come up. One question I did see come through on the chat was Vespasiano, as I recall reading the book, was quite idealistic about what he was trying to achieve. Mm-hmm. I mean, he thought that wisdom would actually improve the lives of people. But as the 15th century went on, he became quite disillusioned, because unfortunately, we can be you can take a horse to water, but sometimes he doesn't drink. And I think that eventually power politics and the rivalries kind of ended up with Italy being into a period of chaos as as he was spending his last couple of decades. So
that's absolutely true because and in many ways, the book is Vespasiano's journey. And in some ways, it's not the happiest of journeys because, as you say, he was idealistic and I think what would I call it? The epigraph for the book is a quote from him where he talks about writers have illuminated the world, chasing away the darkness. And the sort of idea that Petrarch had that if we read these works by the greatest, if we read the best that has been thought and said, we are going to become better people. And as you say, Gary, what manifestly became true for him was that the world did not become a better place in the course of the 1400s. And, in some ways I felt guilty about dwelling a lot on things such as the Pazzi conspiracy and the dreadful violence of it, because Niccolo Machiavelli was 9 years old at that time. And he has written about the way he went out in Florence and the dreadful things that he saw, the horrific violence that was meted out against the Pazzi family, who were friends of Vespasiano. He was friends with the Pazzi and with the Medici. And so he became extremely disillusioned at the end of his life. And I think that, as much as the printing press possibly made him give up his idea of printing, of selling manuscripts, closing his bookshop. And because his writings are shot through with a kind of sadness of the way the greatest families can be brought down, don't trust in things of the world. And he becomes quite religious at the end of his life. I mean, he's religious throughout, as virtually everyone was at that point. But he does say at the end of his life that it's human wisdom that maybe is getting us into difficulty, and we need to go back to divine wisdom instead, which is something that his 25-year-old self would not have said. But it was just the fruits of having seen this terrible destruction in Florence over the course of decade after decade after decade that changed his mind about things.
I see a question here about the production of books, and did Vespasiano hire the scribes? What I was taken with reading the book was how quickly he was able to execute commissions. We need this in 2 weeks. I mean, it was I think kind of amazing. But I didn't know that I could quite get a handle on like how many scribes he had and where they were located and all that. So if you could amplify that a little.
Sure. He had about, say, in the 1460s and 70s, when he was at his most productive, he had probably 40 people in Florence or in the hills outside of Florence, in places like Fiesole. One of his favorite scribes was a guy who lived in a cave. He was a hermit. He was a hermit who had a PhD from the Sorbonne. He was a very well-educated hermit who had lived in Paris for many years, came back to Florence and lived as a hermit in a cave. And Vespasiano, or one of his assistants, presumably took up the manuscripts to him, the exemplar that he was to copy, as well as the sheaves of parchment, gave it to him and had him go to work on it. So Vespasiano himself was not a scribe, but he was really the producer of this. He orchestrated everything. He would find the book that, just to say one other thing that made him so excellent and so sought after, is I quote something from 1446 when Vespasiano is 24 years old, where an abbot in Arezzo wants a copy of Pliny's Natural History, the most popular work from the ancient world. Which it's a wonderful book. Even today, it's a wonderful read. And because it was so popular, there were hundreds of manuscripts of them, each one, of course, different from every other one. And so when the the abbot wanted his own copy of it, he wanted to get the best manuscript version of it copied. He didn't want one riddled with errors. And so he wrote to Florence saying, our Vespasiano is the best guide for such things. So at the age of 24, Vespasiano was the guy who could identify which of the manuscripts was the best one to make a copy from. And it's that sort of quality control that gave him this Europe-wide reputation as such a reliable merchant of knowledge. So he wasn't just creating beautiful books, he was creating beautiful books that were accurate.
Mhm.
So there's an add-on question to the scribe question about who else was actually in the bookshop, employed in the bookshop? Because you said it was a stationer's, it was a reading room, a debating society. So who was all in there?
Sure. What happened was when Vespasiano went into it, it was him, the two sons of Michele Guarducci, and a guy who had a little corner of the shop who was an illuminator, who did the illustrations. So the illustration was actually done on site in those days. And this guy seems to have stayed around for quite some time after that. Vespasiano used him as well. But for the most part, you would have gone into the shop. It was two rooms. There were two doors that would go into it. There'd be the door in what's now the Via del Proconsolo, which is the main entrance to the pizzeria. You would go in and that would be front of house. And so you would go in there and that's where you would see all of the manuscripts and you would buy your supplies of paper and you could sit at a desk. We have eyewitness accounts of people going in and taking a book down and sitting and reading it and saying, oh, you've got the latest book from Giovanni Pontano or something, you know, can I look at it? And you would sit as people do in Starbucks cafes and things like that, sit down at the desk and read the book. And so that was the front of house with, you know, a couple of employees there. Guarducci died in the 1450s. Vespasiano then went into partnership. He never owned the shop outright. He was in partnership with the two sons of Guarducci, but he was really the driving force behind it. So there would have been the three of them and a couple of little errand boys, probably equivalents of what he was at age 11. And we know the names of a couple of them. And one of them actually then took over the bookshop and he added to his name, he took as his surname, da Vespasiano, in order to keep the name alive. And then you would go into the back room, and that was where you would hear the wood being sawed, the parchment being ruled with a stylus, the books being bound, and so forth. And so you'd hear the hammer blows, you'd hear the nails, you'd hear the clanking of chains, because Vespasiano, one of the things he always did throughout his career was put chains. As you saw in that image I showed you, the Hereford Chain Library, many of the books that Vespasiano created, including all of the ones for the Library of San Marco in Florence, all of those had chains. And so you would have had a kind of rattling of chains and things like that in the back room, which was entered both through the shop itself and then through what is now the street just to the running off at a right angle from the Via del Proconsolo, which is also an entrance into the pizza parlor.
Great. Well, Nan, Gary, I don't know if you wanted to ask Nan's question about his descendants. I know, Gary, Ross, early on, you mentioned his young life, right? His parents and his siblings. But was he married? Did he have kids? What happened to the rest of the family?
He did not marry. It's a very interesting family because Vespasiano and two of his brothers became very eminent. He did have a brother who didn't become eminent. And when he filled out his tax form, he would always write that he didn't do anything, which appears to have been true. And he just sort of freeloaded off Vespasiano. But Vespasiano's older brother, his oldest brother, was a guy named Jacopo da Bisticci, and he was the most eminent doctor in Florence. In fact, probably one of the most eminent doctors in all of Italy. And if you fell ill and you were a wealthy person, you would send to Florence for Jacopo da Bisticci. He died prematurely, or not prematurely perhaps, but before Vespasiano. He died in, I believe, 1469. But he was the one that made money. Maybe then, as now, you make more money from being a doctor than from a bookseller or a writer. And so Jacopo made money and was able to buy a big house in Florence in the Via dei Bardi, just south of the river, not too far from the Ponte Vecchio, if you know Florence. And Vespasiano lived there. Jacopo married and had a son named Lorenzo, who was very good friends with with Vespasiano. The two of them appear to have been very close, especially after the death of Jacopo. But Lorenzo died in the plague in 1478, I believe, and Vespasiano was devastated by his death. Leonardo, his sort of hapless brother, married, but much later, and didn't have children. And then the other brother, who was someone who became very eminent, became a priest. He became a Franciscan and was the custodian of the Laverna, where Saint Francis had received the stigmata. And so he was very high up in the Franciscan hierarchy, but for obvious reasons, did not marry. And so the only heir that there was going to be, he had a couple of sisters who had children, but the sisters didn't appear to have married especially well. One married a shoemaker who doesn't seem to have, some shoemakers could have become quite successful, but this guy does not appear to have. And so that family, I wasn't really able to trace them. They didn't appear to throw up anyone especially interesting. Why did Vespasiano not marry? It's unclear. He may have been homosexual, or what we today would call homosexual. There isn't strong evidence of that. One of the odd things that he did was wrote a treatise on women and how women should behave, which is absolutely horrifying. If you ever want your wife, daughter, girlfriend to never speak to you again, all you need to do is get a copy of Vespasiano's treatise on women and give it to her to incur the wrath, because in that respect, he was very much an Italian man of the 1400s. However enlightened and intelligent he may have been in other things. But also, I should just say, last point on that, there were more men than women in Florence in those days, so not every man could marry. There were 120 men for every 100 women. And so there was a lot of competition among men to get married, to get a wife. And a lot of those 100 women went into convents. And one thing I haven't talked about today is a big part of the book, and that is a convent that becomes a printing press. And so I do talk about nuns, but because of the fact that marrying a daughter was expensive because you had to pay a dowry, a lot of people chose not to marry their daughter. It was cheaper to put her in a nunnery, in a convent, where she would be looked after, than to scratch together money to marry her off to someone. And so for those 100 women then start going down, and those 120 men have a very difficult time finding someone to marry. And Vespasiano may have been caught up in that numbers game. He maybe didn't ever have enough money to get married, because sadly, he never appears to have made a huge amount of money in the course of his career, despite the fact that he was creating these wonderful products, which is something sad to contemplate.
Yeah. One of the, there's a question here about the book of the illustrious people that he knew.
Yes.
I remember reading, you have a fair amount about that toward the end of your book. And it actually was undiscovered until, as I recall, like 1830s. And then it was printed, and then it still, even though it was published, it took was Burckhardt, perhaps
That's right.
A German scholar, to actually look at that and look at it in with a scholar's eye, and then start to open up this whole idea of what the Italian Renaissance was really about. Could you amplify that just a little bit?
Sure, that's absolutely right. And it's a wonderful story, and in some ways a sad story, because Vespasiano spent, let's say, the last decade and a half of his life writing his lives of illustrious men, and one woman, incidentally. One woman made it in there. He spent his time writing that. And he, of course, did not commit it to the printing press. He resented it so much, or didn't believe in it. And so his book was never printed. He had maybe 6 or 8 handwritten manuscripts made, which he gave to friends. But these then, of course, most of them were lost. Some of them were then recopied a century or two later. And one of those recopied ones made it into the Vatican Library at some point, probably in the 1600s. And but that no one read it for centuries. No one knew this. And in the 1830s, the librarian of the Vatican, who was a cardinal and a great scholar named Angelo Mai, discovered it and decided that this was quite interesting. But he knew nothing about Vespasiano. He wrote that all we can know about him is that his name was Vespasiano and he lived in the time of Donatello. So he saw it through the publication. And again, nothing much happened until, as you say, Gary, this German, a young German at this point, or sorry, he's Swiss, descends from the Alps into Italy, goes to Rome. He's an art historian and he's going to update an famous German art history textbook and put new images in it and things such as that. And as he's going through the Vatican Library, he discovers Angelo Mai's publication of Vespasiano's work. And the scales fall from his eyes, the heavens open, and he realizes that there is a whole other world besides art. And that is this world of the intellectual renaissance that Vespasiano describes so feelingly and compellingly. And what then happens is that Burckhardt writes what is still today, 150 years after he published it, the most famous and influential book on the Italian Renaissance. And effectively, he invented the Italian Renaissance. The book is called The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And he really popularized the term Renaissance, which is a French one. It was invented by a French historian a decade or two earlier named Jules Michelet to describe what the Italians themselves called the rinascita, the rebirth. Which is what Renaissance means, Renaissance. But Burckhardt used that French term. And so the Renaissance in many ways comes out of Vespasiano and the rediscovery of his work and really the renaissance of Vespasiano himself.
Yeah, so I hate to say this, but we're about 90 minutes in and we really should be wrapping up in a second. So maybe we'll take one more question and I'll answer some of the things that people have asked in the chat and the Q&A regarding the recording for this. So we have recorded this presentation and it's going to be made available both through the Book Club of California and the Book Club of Washington. Gary will figure out how he's going to share this, but we actually put it up on a thing called BCC at Home for book club members, and you'll hear more about that if you're a book club member or not in the follow-up email that we're going to be sending out to everyone tomorrow. And that email will also include some of the information about Ross King, about his YouTube channel, about some of the content that we talked about today. I have put up in the chat a link to Ross's website, which is the link to the book and has links on that page of how you can buy the book. So if you're interested in acquiring the book, go to that link. I will send that link out to everyone tomorrow. So if you missed it, don't worry, you will get it again. So that's, I think, the update on the recording and the follow-up email and some of this stuff. Oh, the one other thing I would say is Russ did a great job covering a lot of the materials and the processes and production of manuscripts in the day. And the book club is hosting a webinar tomorrow evening, more about that. So if you're interested in manuscript production and culture, that's the title of our typical Monday evening program. And you can find out more about that at bccbooks.org/programs or in the emails you might be getting from the book club. You can register for that program tomorrow. So let's see if there's one other question here in the chat before we wrap up. Gary, did you see anything?
No, you go ahead if you see one.
You talked about the writings of, it mentioned that the Urbino Bible has been digitized by the Vatican Library, which is great. And I can put that link out to everyone tomorrow. Oh, there was a question about the quality, because you did mention that Vespasiano was not a big fan of movable type in the printing press. But there's a question about, at the time, did bookmakers and booksellers really have a commitment to like the long-term viability of a book, the quality of the materials of the book at the time?
I think most people embraced it. Vespasiano is very much in a minority in not embracing it. A lot of the humanist philosophers in Florence very quickly embraced it. probably the greatest of all of them, Marsilio Ficino, who's the one who translates Plato from Greek into Latin, became one of the most published authors, most printed authors of the 1400s, because he was very happy. He was a friend of Vespasiano, and had Vespasiano created manuscripts for him, but he was also someone who had everything that he wrote committed to print as well. And so in some ways, this idea that a book would not last was not something that they feared. What they celebrated, in fact, was the opposite. What they said is, if the ancients had had the printing press, we would have everything they wrote. Because the great terror of the scholars of the 1400s was that they would never find certain works of art. They had worried that they would never find Quintilian, which luckily they did. They worried that they would never find Cicero's work on the Republic, which in fact was found only centuries later. And so what they felt they were doing, what they felt the printing press was doing, was safeguarding knowledge for the future. And I give a number of cases in the book of libraries destroyed, such as that at Otranto when Mehmed the Conqueror struck on Italian soil in 1480. And the library was burned, a great library of Greek manuscripts. And so all of these things concentrated the minds of the scholars in Italy. They said, we need to safeguard all of our knowledge. And sadly, Vespasiano, he produced thousands of manuscripts, and hundreds, if not thousands of them have burned, because two of the finest collections that he made, one of which was in Pizarro, went up in flames in the 1500s. Also, a lot of manuscripts that he sent to Hungary ended up burning as well. And so that really is a kind of parable for the way in which knowledge is very tenuous and fragile, and to cross the centuries needs to cross in armies rather than in single formation. And the printing press gave them the ability to do that.
I have to ask this one last question, because I know people will ask me after. Where can people find Vespasiano's writings?
I see someone has asked that. Yes, it is called, Harper Torchbook did a paperback of it, which they call, I've got a hardback back here. I believe that's it right there. But it published in 1926. You might be able to get a copy of that, because various people have asked me how to get it, and they've written back to say they have been able to. There is a Harper Torchbook. If you look up, it's sometimes called the Vespasiano Memoirs, or Lives of Illustrious Men of the 15th century. So I should say, for anyone who has a question about that, or a question about anything else, feel free to, via the contact page on my website, get in touch with me, and I can try to answer your question that way also, because I realize in a forum like this, we can be somewhat pressed for time. I saw, intriguingly, someone wrote that she lived in Woodstock and still has relatives in Rectory Lane, which is about 50 meters from where I am. So it's nice to see that the world is still a small place.
And Russ, I'll send you the comments from the chat and the Q&A. So if there's
good. Perfect.
that you can answer and you want to get back to me or Gary, then we can get back to folks about.
Perfect. Yeah, of course, you can reach.
There's also tons of thank yous and accolades in here about how great your talk was. So I love to share those with speakers as well.
Perfect. Great.
Well, I think now's the time to wrap up. It's a little longer than our usual program, but this was fascinating. We had a lot of interaction, a lot of great questions. So I'll just say that on behalf of the Book Club of California and the Book Club of Washington, Russ, I want to thank you again so much. This was so terrific. We really appreciate your time and your talk. And I also want to thank everyone for attending this presentation today. And lastly, I guess I should thank Gary and the Book Club of Washington for inviting us to partner on this. So thanks all around to everyone. As a reminder, for more information about the book club, you can go to bccbooks.org. And for more information about the Book Club of Washington, you can go to bookclubofwashington.org. So thanks again, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I hope you have a wonderful afternoon and a great evening ahead of you, wherever you might be morning where you are now, but be well and take care of yourself. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.